Is being streamed live on PPS TV Services website and on Channel 28, and will be replayed throughout the next 2 weeks. Please check the district website for replay times. Welcome everyone tonight. This is an important evening for us as a board where we do community engagement, just one facet of the community engagement that the district does around our budget process. And so I turn now to our superintendent, Guadalupe Guerrero, to introduce the process tonight and set us on the right direction as we begin telling the story of PPS, what we're doing and where we're going through this very important budget document. Superintendent Guerrero.
Thank you, Chair Lowry, and good evening, directors. If you'll permit me just to start with a little bit of context here. Our goal over the last few months has been to construct a proposed annual budget. It's the annual exercise. In this case, that leverages all funds available towards a set of priorities. Priorities mainly guided by our continued march towards realizing our PPS vision. And importantly, at supporting students' demonstrated continued improvement towards those goals, those student outcomes set by our Board of Education. So we believe that if we focus on a clearly defined set of strategies, such as improving our organizational capacity, investing in the talent in the school system, that those are some of the ingredients that will pay dividends. So critically, this budget also supports our ongoing commitment to racial equity. So in collaboration with stakeholders and community, so that our Black and Native students in particular have the equitable conditions and supports necessary to experience success. Here's just a few examples of how the funds and the revenue, all the revenue available to this organization, how we've attempted to braid them together to support our students and school communities. $20 million to address student learning needs, proposed investments in more instructional specialists, special education staff, social workers, providing more time for professional development, expanded evening and virtual scholars programs, supporting a Saturday school. Another area of investment includes $13 million to allocate staffing to equitably differentiate and support for socioeconomically disadvantaged and historically underserved students and schools. We're proposing a $10 million package to invest in a community-centered approach for summer learning and enrichment activities to provide that safe, structured, engaging activities and learning opportunities during these upcoming summer months. Those are just 3 areas. You're going to hear staff describe many others. I recognize that you have 2 pretty thick volumes that constitute the proposed budget. I think we all want to get to the point to where we can all give that elevator speech that describes the highlights of this budget. So I'm glad that we'll have opportunities in the coming weeks to continue gaining an understanding of what's in there and sort of coming to some consensus that this is the right approach. So tonight, again, we're joined by, I won't say new because in Portland here, 30 days is the probationary period for our Chief Financial Officer, Norberto Delgadillo, and again, by Danny Ledesma, our Senior Advisor on Racial Equity. But we have a whole virtual green room of senior staff ready to expand on descriptions, take your questions, note your questions. Some we'll have to come back to, but they're also on deck to provide explanations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Norberto.
Thank you, Superintendent Guerrero. Good evening, Chair Lowry and directors. I'm excited to be here once again in front of you and also in front of the community. I'm going to be sharing my screen to get this to share a deck. Let's see if it works. It's always hit and miss, but it's all signs are pointing towards it's working. So I'm going to say otherwise. I'll hear otherwise if it's not, but excited to be here and really, as Superintendent Guerrero said, it's one of our continuing opportunities to share where we are in our process. And I think it's also, I also want to take a moment just to share that, as we go through the work, it's so easy to just like get lost in it, but to take that moment a step back and just really thank the teams, thank all of the individuals that have been involved in making this happen. And it's to this point, right? We haven't crossed the finish line, and that finish line is this theoretical goalpost that moves. And so we get that. But also there's a lot of work that's happened. It isn't just about this one individual moment in time, but it's all the efforts over the past year, over the past few years in community engagement and conversations that we continue in the spirit of continuous improvement and iterative learning that we bring together. And that's what I hope to do today, is to continue that process as we do that. And it's not just from the perspective of an administrator. It's just how we think about the perspective as an English language learner. As you can tell, I still kind of stumble among the words as someone who's been historically underserved, as someone who grew up in a trailer park. So it's like, how do we start bringing all of this together to help tell this story and continue the conversation? And so I will just ask that I'm going to like to say modulate between like the 30,000 foot view, and then we're going to try to like get down to some examples. But again, it's to help provide some context around what's happening. And so high level timeline. So where are we in the process? And as we look at this information here, we know that the state proposes a budget or starts, there's conversations around the budget levels and some internal planning that happens. And then as we go through the process between March and May, which is where we're at, the legislature and us can go through this assessment and take estimates, build the process, or excuse me, build a budget, and then we continue to move along. And I know for our directors, this is very familiar information, but I also want to make sure that our community is aware and we continue to build that understanding around where we are in the process. And simultaneously, our budgeting coincides with the Oregon legislature biennial cycle. So some places or companies, they budget on an annual basis. The state has a biennial cycle, which we follow. And for this budget, we are estimating a state school fund at an biennial level of $9.3 billion and $778 million in student investment account and $318 million high school success fund at the state level, which translates for us about a $2 billion budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And I do want to point out that our budget's available online. We are going to be doing high level broad strokes and then some little clicking in, but we certainly have a lot of this information available on our website. So as we go through this process, you can see some of the detailed funds available on our website. This presentation's available on our website. And in addition to a second budget, or excuse me, the second volume of our budget, yes, there is a second volume that has more details as far as the expenditures at the school sites. So again, if through this process, we may not get to answer our community's questions, and we certainly are going to be collecting feedback, but there are some additional materials available. And so the funds behind the budget is built around really 5 big funds. And there's a lot of information on this slide. And one of the key things to point out is that the general fund and the special revenue fund are 2 key funds that allow us to really carry forward the programs, while the debt service fund, capital project fund, and internal service funds tend to be more restricted towards capital projects, paying back debt, workers' comp. And so these 5 funds do build our budget. That's approximately the $2 billion. And so then Another question that I come across when having conversations with folks who are getting familiar with school budgets, it's like, well, where does the money come from? And so approximate percentages of our budget is about 92% are from the state and local level. And that includes our property taxes, that includes the state funding formula, and about 8% from the federal side. And then a lot of organizations have what you call an operating budget. So it's like essentially the ability to move the work, as I was mentioning earlier. And for this year, our budget is about 50-50 split. So about $1 billion towards the capital projects, and then about another $1 billion to what one could say our operating budget, which is like the general fund and the special revenue fund. And so when we start taking a closer look at our general fund and special revenue fund, we see the change from last year to this year. And we see that for the general fund, it's an increase of about 14.2 million. For the special revenue fund, about 102.4. And it's also important to note that these funds are really what help like keep the lights on, as a figure of speech, as we continue to support the primary programs. And also, along with keeping the lights on, it's also keeping to specific requirements in how these funds are spent. So there's some very specific guidelines regarding how special education funds can be spent. How can title federal grants be spent? Our local option levy, which is specifically for teachers. So there are a variety of different guidelines and requirements as we go through understanding how the funds can support each other to be combined to create our budget. And so then how are general funds and the special revenue funds spent? Like similar school, like many districts across the country, the majority of it is in personnel. And so when we start thinking about our investment in people, it's the supplies, the utilities, thinking about summer programs, the affinity groups, athletics, and any sort of contract that we have and with our partners or vendors that falls under the non-personnel side of the house. So as building the context around all the several funds, because it's so easy to say, wow, $2 billion, but then, okay, that's $1 billion that needs to go over here. And okay, well, there's $1 billion over here. And then what's happening with all the other funds? And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more detail in our budget volumes, but hopefully this information here starts to help lay the general foundation. And so we're talking about the general fund. Within the general fund, there's several other funds, but there are 3 key funds that make up about 80% of it, and 85% of the fund. And so our property taxes, our state school fund, and our local option levy combined make up about 85% of our general fund. And so when we look across the trend over the past few years, we see how some funds have increased over time. Other funds have changed. There's been a decline. We have local option levy, for example, that's steadily been fairly steady. And then in addition to that, as we look across these various funds, we also have to think about how do these funds play a role in supporting each other when that's possible. So as an example, the local option levy fund specifically for funding additional teachers. We can't then use that to pay for utilities or to pay for contract with a vendor to pay for the audit or things like that. So it's like, again, very specific items. When compared to the state school fund, it's an opportunity that gives us, it's a fund that allows for an opportunity to be more flexible in how we leverage our funds. But there is this continued assessment in how the funds interplay with each other. And so I'll just revert back. So that's the general fund, right? That's 3 key funds. There's several other funds that we have more detail in our budget book. And then our special revenue fund, right? So sticking to the theme of our overall general operating budget, we have the general fund. We just talked about 3 funds. And now we're talking about the special revenue funds. With the special revenue fund, similar to what we just discussed, there's several funds that make up the special revenue fund, from federal programs to additional the stimulus relief dollars are in our special revenue fund. And then this slide here calls out 2 key funds that are that originate at the state level. We have our student investment account, which focuses on several critical things, critical areas. And last year, leading into last year, we had to pivot, make some adjustments based on the COVID recession and what we encountered. And then now, as we're looking forward to next year, there is a change of about $19 million that goes towards these very specific activities. And again, there's additional details in our budget book. And with the high school success measure 98, again, similarly, there's been changes over time, but this also gives us a specific opportunity to invest in how we continue or expand our programs in dropout prevention, career and technical education, and so forth. Speaking of federal stimulus dollars, so part of the special revenue fund are those stimulus dollars. And over the course of the past year, there's been 3 rounds of funding that the federal government has enacted. And the information on this slide gives a general estimate of what we received after our allocations to our pass-throughs to our per our federal and state guidelines. And then simultaneously, our projected expenditures, not just for the current year, but also what we anticipate to spend over the course of that ESSER round of funding, over the course of the life of that ESSER round of funding. With knowing that there's specific guidelines in place and specific timelines in place, we're working towards not just investing for next year, but really what does then the following summer look like? What does then the following year look like? Because we have to not just put these investments to exceptional use, we also have to be thinking realistically that these are one-time funds. So we need to make sure that as we work through our planning, how are we thinking about sustainability? Particularly after the uncertainty that we just had with enrollment over this year, what is that going to look like for next year and so forth? And how did then these funds support that sustainability? And so with all that in mind, as we start bringing it down to provide some key examples, Superintendent Guerrero mentioned earlier some of the key activities that we're investing in. When we start thinking about how we leverage all of these funding streams to put together a robust plan, and everything from how we have a community-wide request for proposal to really focused on community-centered approach for summer enrichment. $8 million to enhance the learning environment by class size stability. So we talked about how there is enrollment uncertainty. So we want to mitigate disruption to that and be able to invest and hold for next year. In addition to how we're thinking about extending summer access to childcare, extending contracts with SUN and our SJ partners. So these are some of the examples of some key investments in learning, while on the other side of the house, in the operations side of the house, there's additional investments as well that are in our budget. $330 million to continue the work in modernizing our high schools, $58 million towards investing in our technology infrastructure, $5 million to support COVID recovery. So including how are we thinking about serving meals in various learning modes, whether it's comprehensive distance learning, limited in person, it's ensuring that we can be able to provide the necessary meals to our students regardless of learning models or learning modes. And as we go through this budgeting process, there's another key component to this is as I mentioned earlier, how are we continuing to work towards building our budget, not just for the moment, but for a continued approach with our continued approach to developing our strategic plan through a racial equity and social justice lens. So to talk a little bit more about this, I want to turn it over to our Senior Director, Danny Ledesma, who will shed a little bit more light on this, particularly for our community, as we continue to get feedback and share how we're approaching our budget.
Thanks, Norberto. So the last time we were together, we talked a little bit about this, and I don't believe you had all of the materials, but earlier today we sent you our sort of staff work that we completed for your consideration and for our community's consideration of how, as the budget proposal came all together, how we applied the racial equity and social justice lens to this work, so that we can continue, like Norberto said, to continue to grow and think about how we're aligning our investments strategically in a way that really affirms our beliefs and values, specifically around racial equity. So as we talked about before, we did want to include an update to the RESJ lens. So we added some more information in that preamble that discusses what the lens is to align it towards our vision, as well as our emerging strategic plan. The other thing that we did is that in addition to the 6 prompts, the questions that asked you, the typical questions that asked you sort of like which stakeholders were involved, we did some slight adjustments to that. But we also added a second section of prompts where we wanted to make sure that we were really anchoring our decisions and our thought process to data. And so Dr. Brown and his team in the Office of Systems Performance created an RESJ dashboard for us that looked at indicators in a couple of different areas. And each of these updated prompts or these questions asked folks to go into the data so that we can build our data literacy and to start to think about how we answer those questions using the data and also some of the higher level sort of critical thinking about our wonderings. We'll talk a little bit about some of our answers, but what we wanted to let you know is that both in its development and in its final proposal, staff at all levels have been really trying to think about how do we apply a really sharp critique to our budget proposal to make sure that we are sort of living into and sort of taking into action our values around racial equity. So in the document that I provided for you earlier today, you have the updated questions. And I just want to point out that these questions were answered at a moment in time. We are going to ask folks, I'll run through some of those questions and answers with you today to just do some highlights so you can see how the update is working. But then we're also going to leave as a takeaway for community members to sort of invite them to read kind of our intentions and our thought process around the racial equity lens, with hopes that as we continue to move through this process, we'll get your thoughts as a board in terms of how you think that the budget really responds to the lens, as well as giving our community an opportunity to do that. So in that document, if you're following along, on page 7 of the document is where we have these new questions, these additional prompts that link it to a dashboard. And so one of the first questions that we ask is, how does the proposed action close the disparity between student and teacher diversity? And so what we answered is that we talked about how this budget is yet another step in our continual investment in really promising practices that are being led by several departments to diversify our staffing at PPS. We know that we are not only hiring more people, but we're also hiring more people with the intention of trying to diversify our staff. And one of this places where we're really proud of has been in the investment in additional counselors and social workers. And we've seen an increase in the diversity of that employee group. So we talk a little bit about that. We also want to make sure that folks are really also thinking about some of the support of existing programs, such as a really successful Aspiring Leaders Initiative that's being led by Dr. Kimberly Mateer, where we're working with folks who are aspiring into that sort of school administrator position, and we're seeing a lot of very fast results from that. So that was sort of one way where we wanted to look specifically at that sort of demographics of staff. In the second question, we talk about, the question is, how does the proposed action create opportunities to create student achievement in math and English language arts for Black and Native students? And if you were thinking about our board goals and also thinking about this question, one of the updates to the racial equity lens is to try to get some more alignment. As people are making decisions, we want to anchor in those board goals around achievement, around student achievement. And so in our answer, we really point to the specific investments around learning acceleration. We point out instructional specialists, the specific culturally specific support for Native American students, technology support, and then also the deeper amount of investments in curricular supports or in curriculum supports. The other question that we ask about is how does the proposed action create opportunities for growth in math and ELA? And so we really look to, again, not only looking at those instructional strategies, but also looking at some of those support strategies so that we're creating that exponential growth that we really need to be able to close some of those gaps. So we spoke to the support for youth leadership activities, student-led conferences. We also spoke to the investments in mentoring and leadership development. The fourth question asks, how does the proposed action disrupt predictable racial patterns in discipline for Pacific Islander, Black, and Native students? Again, going back to the data, folks pointed out that we've hired additional social workers for all of our title middle schools and K-8s. Well, we're still continuing our investments that were made last year in multiple pathways to graduation. We're investing further in SEL, in social emotional learning. We're really wanting to improve coaching and partnerships by providing more opportunities for professional development. We're also continuing to increase behavioral and mental health supports, including contracts with culturally specific mental health and behavioral health providers. The last question has to do with high school graduation. And this one is really pointed. It asks, how does the proposed action create greater opportunities for high school graduation for Native students? Again, we want to be anchored in data. And so we talked about how a lot of the proposed investments are intended to support Native students for both academically and social and emotionally. And we point to specific investments in the Indian Education Program, the CBO School Funding for Many Nations Academy, and the RESJ partnerships with Native Family Center to provide positive cultural identity development, culturally specific family engagement, and wraparound services. So this is a high level sort of update of the RESJ lens, but I did want to sort of point out some of those specific answers that we gave to those prompts, hopefully as a way that sparks some of your own critiques, some of your own wonderings and thoughts as a board you consider some of our investments, and we wanted to really highlight these for you. So in the next portion of the meeting, one of the things that we're going to ask folks to do is to give us feedback. particularly related to the RESJ lens. We wanted to ask folks when they are reading the budget and listening to folks like Nilberto present on the budget and thinking about the racial equity and social justice lens, kind of what is that initial reaction? What does that gut tell you about where we are in the work? The second question is that we want more specific feedback that folks may have as we consider the proposed budget. Are there additional places in the questions that we need to examine more? Is there feedback about some of the prompts that we answered and how we answered them? And then the third question is, what questions or wonderings are folks left with? Are there things that are left unanswered? Are there questions that beget other questions? We really want to make sure that we're leaving a lot of space and room for folks to get their feedback out in as many ways as possible. So you'll notice in the budget, in the slide deck, there's a link to the budget feedback form. It's a Google form that we'll all have access to so that we can continue to learn and grow from the reactions to this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nilberto for the next portion.
Thank you, Danny. And yeah, I wanted to, I know usually Google form links are fairly complex and long. So we want to make sure that we had that up there for our community to take a look at. But again, the deck will be available. There'll be an opportunity to leverage the link. And we're also in the process of working with our community engagement department to schedule additional opportunities between now and the 25th. So this is really just part of the ongoing process and opportunities to connect with our students, to connect with other community partners. And so fairly soon over the next few days that information and dates will be confirmed. And so speaking of dates, just a reminder again, I know there's a lot of information here. So it's just opportunity to visit our website and get additional information. And really, I think that it's one thing to have a fairly robust technical document, but it's always important to hear the type of questions folks may have to then help translate that into, like, what does this mean for my school? Or if there are any other conversations. And we should then also be able to continue to refine our process and do that. And I believe we also have, and Danny, I don't recall if we got a chance to post our budget, our ResJ budget document as well. So the document that you were just talking through with our directors, that's also going to be available online as well for broader viewing. And in addition to that, to provide feedback.
Unfortunately, it wasn't posted till this morning.
Well, just to be clear, directors, that's an internal exercise we did as a cabinet this morning. So in the spirit of transparency, we're just sharing with directors how we're responding and thinking about those questions. So we just wanted to provide that sort of insight. I would hope the directors sort of at the end of sort of understanding what we're proposing to invest in, that we can all have sort of responses to these kinds of questions in the protocol.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. It was helpful to see.
Thank you. And just as far as upcoming timeline, this high-level timeline of activities and upcoming engagements, I did just mention we're going to be working towards getting together with additional community members to provide and engage in additional conversations between now and the 25th. So our community engagement team is working to finalize those dates. And last, but definitely not least, I wasn't sure from a protocol perspective if this portion of the meeting, I believe we had public comment signups, but then also I don't know if Chair Lori, if you have specific process that you wanted to continue with, and whether it's conversations or, excuse me, questions or whatnot, but I just wanted to pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much, CFO Delgadillo. We are going to go ahead and move into a public hearing at this juncture. The board will have opportunity for more questions and comments after this when we go into our executive session time. So we are going to go ahead and I'm going to call this public hearing for May 4th, 2021 to order and convene the board as the budget committee. And I want to thank those of you who are watching online and those of you who've signed up to give public comment. The board will hear your comments on the superintendent's proposed budget. No exec session. I'm getting notes from Roseanne that we only have one public commenter that's joined us so far, and that we aren't going into exec session. It's a follow-up work session. Is that correct, Roseanne? Okay. I apologize. My script said said exec session at some point, and I just, went with it. Sometimes you just I'm like the character on Anchorman. You just put it in front of me and I'll read it. So that could be problematic. All right. The board will hear public comment on the superintendent's proposed 2021-22 budget. And I'm going to request, we had a request of limit to 2 minutes, but since we only have one person who's here so far, we'll up that to 3 minutes because, feeling generous, because public feedback is very important to us. And the board acting as the budget committee will take the public comment we've received via email, the public comment we hear tonight, any of the public comment that you choose to submit after watching this tonight before we approve the budget, which will be scheduled for May 25th. Now, if you haven't been able to sign up for public comment, we would still love to hear from you. And Roseanne, did we work it out that people could join in this meeting?
Yes, if people would like to provide public comment and they're interested, they could email publiccomment@pps.net and Kara will send the link information.
Okay, so just to be clear, if you are watching this right now and you did not sign up for public comment, but you would like to give public comment on the budget tonight, you can email publiccomment@pps.net and you will get a link to this meeting and you can join in for public comment. If you are watching this later, not live, or if you don't feel like jumping into public comment tonight, you can email us your written comments at publiccomment@pps.net. And again, your thoughts are very important to us as we do this work. So please do send us those comments. Tonight, to our commenters who are joining us, please make sure you begin your comment and clearly state your name and spell your last name. And you'll have 2 minutes to speak, and 3 minutes to speak, and you will hear a sound after 3 minutes, which means it is time to conclude your comments. Ms. Bradshaw, would you like to call the first person who has signed up for public comment?
Yes, with Amy Sylvia.
Hi, my name is Amy Sylvia, S-I-L-V-I-A. My pronouns are she and her. I just want to say hi, good evening, Superintendent Guerrero and school board members. Like I said, my name is Amy Sylvia, and I'm a lead in the Nutrition Services Department. Right now I work at Maplewood Elementary, and I worked in nutrition services for over 8 years. I'm also a union officer, and I spoke to you about 2 months ago about respecting, protecting, and paying us for the essential work that we do. And we're really glad that the district agreed to provide a pandemic recognition payment, acknowledging our dedication and the central role that we play in ensuring a healthy and safe school environment. Excuse me. This was an important first step towards equity and for this historically undervalued workforce. The next step would be to include nutrition services in the general fund budget and provide our predominantly female workforce an actual living wage. Unfortunately, the proposed budget does not do that. As written, it continues a long legacy of treating women's work as unimportant. How else do you explain only budgeting $26,000 for cost of living adjustments for 180 workers? How else can you justify paying entry-level workers only $14.40 an hour? We need wages that will attract new employees who want to make this their career. True equity requires structural change. We're asking you to invest general fund dollars to raise the standards for this historically undervalued group. Will go a long way towards achieving your strategic priority of having a diverse and stable staff. Another key priority is to invest in the future of our building facilities by hiring and retaining more union custodians. We're glad to see that the proposed budget has funding for additional custodial staff. Years of understaffing will require years of continued investment. A couple key things you can do are to bring back the rovers, which are a key part of the training program, and add a longevity bonus so we can train and maintain our custodial staff to protect the multi-million-dollar trust our community has put us in. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for being here and showing up. And can I just say the room you're in is just so joy-filled with the color pink and the artwork behind you. So I think, you know, as you've said, nutrition service workers are some of those who bring a lot of joy to our students and show up and have done such an amazing job this year caring for our students. And it's so appropriate for you to be speaking from that space.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Ms. Bradshaw, do we have anybody else who's come for public comment tonight?
We do not.
Okay. I'm looking for Roseanne. Have you received any emails, Ms. Powell? It seems like she has not. So I do have to say that the place in the script that I saw the words executive session were in a note telling me how to get us into executive session if we need to. So I am just officially at the point in my term as board chair where I'm making things up. So that's where we are tonight. So I guess we're at the point where, since there is no further public comment, that we can take a short break and then we will move into the second part of our board work session. Roseanne, is that a thumbs up? Okay, so we will take a 13-minute break and be back at 7 for our next part of our work session. Thanks, everyone.
Haley,
Yes.
maybe before we break it, just a question, because there was a reference to other community meetings, which I don't think are on our budget calendar. So if there were, I guess I'd like to request that if there's going to be additional meetings with community partners or community groups, that board members be notified so that we can attend those, just as a way to get additional community feedback, since it's the official budget calendar is limited.
Great. And I think what I heard from Norberto is that they're working with community engagement to schedule those. Is that correct? Okay. So
That is correct.
once we have those, we can get those on. So, okay, we'll see everybody back in 12
I
minutes.
have one last question as well. For those that are still there, is there going to be one central place that we will be able to review all of the feedback in one spot that comes from community?
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't sure if that question was aimed at me. I'm jumped in like, yes.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, the idea would be to, as we go through the process, similar to like the form and whatnot, the team will then compile and put together to then be able to share, inclusive of any other questions that board directors may have as we go through the process, so that we can try to create so not just for the time being, like collect information, but also subsequently, are there any themes or future FAQs that we can just continue to put out there and continue to help inform and just build understanding? But yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And we will have time for more questions during our work session that's coming up. And it is a separate link. So we'll exit out of this work session, and then you'll find the email that says you're a panelist, and it says click here in the email. And that's how you get into the next meeting. Thanks, everyone. See you in 10 minutes.